Well, what a joy. I just can't tell you how happy I am in so many ways. First of all, I'm happy to be here with you today. People ask me a lot, do you miss it? And the reality is, what I miss are people. I miss getting to see you folks that I've walked through life with for the past 20 years. And it's a joy every now and then to get to be here. I think I've been here 4 Sundays since last January when I stepped out of the pastorate. And it's always been a delight. But we love that we're still members at Buck Run, and you are our church family. And it just feels so great to be here and to be able to open the Word of God to you today. And I just can't thank you enough. Tanya and I could not feel more loved nor appreciated than the way you have treated us, and we're grateful, man, the beautiful patio that the church had there installed at our home. It just looks great. We look forward to warm weather coming back so we can enjoy that again. Not much sitting outside these days, but it's coming. It's coming. And also, just what a precious thing to see Pastor Chris and the pastors here just doing such a great job. It just makes me happy. I can't stress that enough. People, when I go, I get asked about this a lot. I'm on a lot of panels and Q&As, and people ask about the transition here at Buck Run. And inevitably, somebody will say, okay, if you had to do over again, what would you do differently? And my answer is not a thing. Not a thing. I think the transition is just, it was no drama, no trauma, and it just went beautifully, and we just rejoice in God's continued hand on this church. It's one of the happiest things. Every time I'm here, I see new faces, people I don't know, because the Lord is adding to His church, and that's just a great encouragement. I have had a marvelous time with these students. Man, we've had a great time at Amplify, and they've been great and have listened so well, and it's been a joy to open the Word to them. And now I want to open it with you. So if you would turn to Genesis chapter 22, though in one sense, part of our text has already been read because Hebrews 11 sort of summarizes the life of Abraham in those verses that were read today. And there in Hebrews 11, you have 4 tests that Abraham had to pass. And they are pretty clear. The first one is what I call the test of a major change. God appeared to Abram when he was there in Ur of the Chaldees, and he said, I want you to go to a land I will show you. He didn't even tell him where it was. He didn't even name it at the time. He just said, I want you to go. And when God says go, the proper response is not to say where. The proper response is just to say yes. And he followed God's leading even without knowing where. Second test was the test of a deferred promise. God said, I'm going to give you that land. But you know what? He never got that land. We read there in Hebrews, our pastor read to us there in Hebrews 11, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised. In other words, they saw that God's promise would be fulfilled even beyond their lifetime. They weren't living merely for their day, but for what would come. And that was certainly true of Abraham. He was able to trust God's timing without knowing when. He didn't know when God was going to do it, but he knew God would keep His word. He knew God would keep His promise. But then there was the major change, the major problem, what I call the test of an impossible problem. He was told, you and your wife Sarah are going to have a son. And man, the clock kept ticking. Sarah was well beyond the age of having children. I mean, she hits 90 years old. And can you imagine if you go to your grandmother's house for Christmas and you say, Grandma, how are you? And she says, oh, I got news. I'm pregnant. That may not even just shock you. It might gross you out a little bit. But that's exactly what happened. You heard that detail in the text, and his flesh as good as dead. I don't think I need to spell that out for you, what that means. And yet, here they had this impossible problem, and yet they acted in faith, and he trusted God's power without knowing how God would do it. And yet, God moved and gave them that son, Isaac. But then, he faced the most difficult test of all. And God said, I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and I want you to offer him. It's the test of a senseless sacrifice. I mean, that simply makes no sense. Now he has to trust God's heart without knowing why God is asking of him what he's asking. It doesn't fit in anything. I'm going to read to you the entirety of Genesis, the first 18 verses of Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham? And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, you stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and he laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together, and Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father? And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, don't lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah-Jireh. The Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. I think outside of the account of the crucifixion in the four Gospels, outside of the cross itself, this is the most remarkably difficult passage of Scripture to comprehend. Because really, outside of the cross, this makes no sense at all. Through the years, Bible scholars, rabbis, a lot of people philosophers have struggled with this text. In Hebrew, the passages in the Bible have certain names. Remember, Jesus talked about in the passage about the bush. He referred to the burning bush, and it just had a name. Well, this passage is called the Akedah, which simply means the binding. It's the binding of Isaac. Not properly the sacrifice of Isaac, because Abraham wasn't actually made to go through with it. In his heart, he sacrificed him. He was certainly willing, but he bound Isaac and laid him on the altar. Now, a lot of people have had problems with God demanding human sacrifice at all, especially of the child that he himself had promised to Abraham and to Sarah. The Nobel Prize winning author Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, called this passage terrifying in content. Woody Allen had a whole comic routine about it and said God was joking and Abraham was simply overwhelmed by a resonant, well-modulated voice. A lot of rabbis have argued that Abraham actually misunderstood God and mistook his meaning. Some even suggested that this was a fallen angel, a satanic angel trying to deceive Abraham so that he would end the life of the promised son and there would not be a nation of Israel. The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that the voice that demanded such a thing could not possibly be God. That if in fact he were God, holy, just, and good, he could not possibly demand such a thing from Abraham, not even though he stopped him. But we have to take, I think, the text at face value, or else we might as well discard all the Bible. If we're going to say, well, he mistook him, or surely this couldn't have been, then in reality you're going to get rid of all the Bible, because nothing makes less sense than the fact that a holy God would offer his only son to die for broken, sinful humanity. So once you start saying, well, we've got to sort of explain this away, we can't take it at face value, you're going to lose the whole Bible. We have to believe it. It's exactly as it's written here. God spoke to Abraham and told him that he wanted to offer his only son. He used three terms: that your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. And he told him that he wanted him to take him far away. They're a 3 days journey from down in the Negev, down near Beersheba, and to take him to what we know as Jerusalem today, to a mountain there was then called Moriah, later Mount Zion, to that very place. And he wanted him to offer his son there. Now, when you read this, you realize, man, God is not behaving like we expect him to. He's not safe. He is challenging everything that Abraham thinks he knows about God. God has promised to bless him. God has promised him this son, and then he gave him this son, and he said, through that son, not through some other son, through this one, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And yet, before Isaac is old enough to be married and to have children, God says, I want you to take him, go on this journey, and I want you to offer him to me. Now, this makes no sense. God will challenge your complacency of life. We think, we've sort of got it figured out. If I'm a Christian, I say I believe in Jesus. On Sundays, I go to church, I tithe, I go to prayer meeting on occasion. I'm ticking off the items on the list. I'm doing the things that a Christian is supposed to do. And God surely won't require any more of me. I do that. But God has a way of unsettling you from your comfortable surroundings. And down there in the Negev, where Abraham, he's got a well, he's got his flocks and his herds, and he's comfortable there. He's sort of settled there. And yet God says, I want you to offer your son. Not here. I want you to go elsewhere. And God will even make you cut the wood on which you will offer your most beloved and precious offering. God will unsettle your life completely. He'll challenge your commitment of self. You'll think you're really committed to the Lord. You'll delude yourself into thinking you're doing the things you ought to do. And then God will want you to take the very things he's given you and burn it up for some reason. It's like that makes no sense. The missionary to India, Amy Carmichael, wrote a poem. But these strange ashes, Lord, this nothingness, this baffling sense of loss, Son, was the anguish of my stripping less upon the torturing cross? Was I not brought into the dust of death? A worm, and no man I. Yea, turned to ashes by the vehement breath of fire on Calvary? Oh, Son, this is thy heart's desire. This and no other thing follows the fall of consuming fire on the burnt offering. Go on and taste the joy set high, afar. No joy like that to thee. See how it lights the way like some great star. Come now and follow me. Amy Carmichael is referring to the fact that Jesus endured the suffering of the cross. Why? For the joy that was set before him. There's a joy out there, but he has to go through these strange ashes of the consuming fire of the wrath of God. And when sometimes God requires of us something we don't want to part with, more than we want to give, and we say, really, Lord, these strange ashes, this nothingness? What good can this possibly do for me to give this to you when you have everything? You are the owner of all that is. Why would you require this from me? And God points us to the cross, where Jesus endured the suffering for the joy that was set before him, like some distant star illumining the path. The joy's not immediate, it's beyond. And before you get it, there's the wood of an altar upon which to be consumed. See, God will challenge your conception of ownership. Because He's given you everything you have. And the problem is we forget that He has the right to say, now I want it back. He gave you those children. Does He not have the right to say, oh, I want that one to go to a Muslim country? I want this one to be a medical missionary and work in Africa among the HIV-infected population. Well, I want this one to be an executive with some big corporation, in a country that won't allow missionaries in, but it'll let people who work for Coca-Cola in. God wants to take your child and send them somewhere. Have you forgotten He gave them to you? I mean, we have spent the last 2 days with these students trying to put a burden on their heart for the world and the nations, and trying to tell them that just like God used Joseph to save his people, that's the very purpose for their lives. God wants to use them to save his people. But the sad thing is, some of them would get opposition not from the lost world, but from Christian parents or grandparents or a community that says, oh, surely you don't want to go there. There's a way for you to serve God here. God will challenge your conception of ownership. Is that being harsh with you? Is he demanding too much? You know, notice a little detail here. In verse 2, when God speaks to Abraham, he uses 3 things to describe Isaac. Your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. If you look down at verses 12 and 16, after the binding, after God stays Abraham's hand and says, stop, I will provide a sacrifice. He said, now I know that you fear me. Look how he speaks of Isaac in verse 12. Now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Down in verse 16. By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. What's different? It's as though God was saying to Abraham, your love for Isaac is out of order. See, being a Christian is all about ordering your loves. And you're to love God above all else. You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You can have no other gods before you. It's not wrong for a parent to love his child, is it? But he can turn that child into an idol when he loves the child more than God. You can love anything in your life more than God. God may have blessed you with a great job. He might have blessed you with things, relationships, wonderful things, none of which are wrong. It's great for you to enjoy life and the things God has provided for you. But when God asks them back, if there's any hesitation, if there's anything in your spirit that says, oh, I don't want to part with this, then you've turned it into an idol. God will challenge that conception of ownership. You don't own it. You're just loaned that for a time. And he'll challenge your confidence of trust. I mean, God's demand here of Abraham seems to break his own promise, because he has promised Abraham that through Isaac all the nations of the world will be blessed. And yet now he's saying, I want you to sacrifice him. And you can see Abraham, man, he's gone through something of a process. We've seen Abraham stumbling. We've seen twice he feared people so much that he had Sarah lie about her relationship to him and deny that she's his wife because he was afraid of his life, afraid for his life. In fact, just in the chapter right before this, in chapter 20, when Abimelech, the king, realizes that Abraham has lied to him and said that Sarah was his sister, not his wife. Abimelech said to Abraham in verse 10 of chapter 20, "What did you see that you did this thing?" And Abraham said, "I did it because I thought, there's no fear of God at all in this place, and they'll kill me because of my wife." Now, that's the very first time the phrase, the fear of God, ever occurs in the Bible. And it's coming out of the mouth of Abraham in a judgment on the people where he's sojourning. "Why did you lie, Abraham? What were you afraid of?" And he said, "Oh, I looked around and I said, there's no fear of God in these people." Well, there was fear of man in somebody. And God, he saw there in Abraham a quick judgment that other people didn't fear God. And that's why chapter 22 begins with God is testing Abraham. What's he testing? He's testing Abraham to see whether or not he fears God. He's challenging Abraham's confidence of trust. And he's asking the question, can you meet God's demand trusting that he keeps his word? And Abraham walking up Mount Moriah with his son, he's a different man there than he was in chapter 20. He tells when he leaves the two servants behind, he says, I and the boy will go there and we will return. Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that Abraham knew that if God had to bring him back from the dead, if God required him to go through with it and to slaughter his own son, then God would resurrect him and raise him up, because God had promised that this is the child of promise. Through this one, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And if God wanted Abraham to kill him just so he could bring him back to life, he would do it. He's testing Abraham to see, do you fear me now? And what is it that God says in chapter 22 in verse 12? After Abraham passes the test, God says, now I know you fear me. If you fear the loss of something or someone more than you fear God, your love is out of order. Are you willing for God to challenge you? Because ultimately, God will challenge your conviction of belief. Do you really believe God? See, God's call will make you struggle with faith and reason. It'll make you struggle in fear and trembling, because the thing he requires of you often seems to go against what you think is the good thing. It's a good thing for my children to be in a safe country. It's a good thing for me to keep my money for myself, to take care of myself in my old age. I mean, you can always talk yourself into disobedience to God because of all the good things you need to do. I mean, this is what, there was a Christian philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard who wrote an amazing essay on this called Fear and Trembling. And he said, man, this is the quintessential leap of faith where Abraham demonstrates an absolute trust in God, even in the face of an incomprehensible and morally tragic command. I mean, the temptation for Abraham was to do the good thing instead of the God thing. I mean, the good thing is you don't kill your son. But God, who gave him that son, said to him unequivocally, there was no question. Abraham knew this is what God said. He didn't struggle with whether or not God had said it. He understood perfectly God was requiring him to sacrifice his own son. And the binding of Isaac challenges reason and ethics and even human understanding of justice, because it focuses on that individual relationship with God. Are you willing to trust God when you don't understand what he's requiring of you? And Kierkegaard emphasized that Abraham is totally alone. And he compared it to learning to swim. He says, when you learn to swim, you might stand on the shore going through the motions, like, learn to put one hand over the other and pull and kick. And he said, but eventually you've got to get in the water. You can't learn to swim only by standing on the shore going through the motions. But he says that in all the Bible, Abraham is the only one who ever really gets in the water. He said, everybody else is doing this on the shore. Abraham alone plunges in because this is a demand of God unlike anything else in all the Bible. And he's right except for one thing. There is something else in the Bible like this. Because God does not allow Abraham to go through with the very thing God himself is going to go through with. Abraham, as he goes up, when, I've heard a lot of fanciful things. A lot of preachers will talk about what Isaac must have said and thought, but frankly, I think we need to just leave it where the scripture leaves it. All we know Isaac said and thought was he started figuring out, we got the wood, we have the knife, where's the animal? And interestingly, in Hebrew, it uses a sort of a generic word. It doesn't use the normal word for lamb. It uses the word for like an animal. And Abraham answers him back. He says, well, that's all right. God will provide an animal for himself. He'll provide a sacrifice himself. I don't know the degree to which Abraham understood his own words then. I don't know how much he understood that a Messiah would come. I know he knew the promise that God gave in Genesis chapter 3, there would come a seed of the woman who would bruise the head of the serpent. I know that God had taught Abraham the principle of sacrifice, that it takes sacrifice for sin to be remitted. And Abraham knew that one day God was going to offer one great sacrifice for sin, that every sacrifice that he offered was simply pointing forward. It was like paying the interest on a debt. And one day God himself was going to have to pay the principal and take care of all the debt of sin. But Abraham could not have known what you and I know on this side of the cross and the empty tomb. Because every sacrifice God requires, he provides. He does not ask anything of us that he himself does not give us. He enables us. He's not taking anything from you that he didn't provide, and he's not asking anything of you that he himself did not give. He knows what it's like to send your son into a hostile place. He knows what it's like to see people reject and mock and spit on his beloved. He knows what it is to see his dear only begotten son hang on a cross. It's no accident that God led Abraham to Mount Moriah, later known as Mount Zion, where the temple would be built, where untold thousands of sacrifices through the centuries would be slaughtered and offered on an altar, until one day, on that same mountain mass, on the other side of the wall, outside the city, between two thieves, God sacrificed his son, his only son, the son he loved, so that you and I might be free from sin and death and hell. And I've spent this weekend telling these students that God's great purpose for their lives is to use them so that through them, God will save his people who don't yet know the gospel. When God calls them, will you celebrate it? Will you rejoice? What matters more to you? To spend eternity with your child or to have them live close to you in this life? It's a bad trade to say, I'd rather have my children down the street from me and not care about eternity. Long ago, I told the Lord, my children are yours. And as long as I can spend eternity with them, I will never begrudge you sending them anywhere. Now I'm a grandfather. And I look at my precious Stella and Henry and Hershel and Harper and Jenny. And I just love being with them. I just love being with them. It's just such a delight. But if God takes them and sends them somewhere where they give their lives for the gospel, would I grieve? Would I sorrow? Would I miss them? Absolutely I would. But as long as I get to spend eternity in the presence of Jesus with them, I cannot begrudge God saying, I gave them to you. Now I want them back. Elizabeth Elliot wrote a book, and she took the title of the book from that poem I quoted earlier by Amy Carmichael. The title of the book is These Strange Ashes. And it tells the story of the year she spent as a lone, solo, single missionary way up in the jungle of Ecuador. And she was trained in Greek and linguistics, and her goal was to translate. First of all, she had to learn this particular native language. It had no alphabet, so she was going to have to learn the language, give it an alphabet, and then translate the Bible into that language. And this is painstaking work. And to do it, you have to have someone that's called an informant. She found one person who'd been a member of this tribe and spoke that was their native language, and they also spoke Spanish. Only one. And she spent that year every day talking with this informant, trying to learn the language. And back then, this is before computers, she wrote everything down on 3x5 note cards and indexed everything. So she's collecting all this data where she's learning this language so she can reduce it to an alphabet and come up with a vocabulary and then begin to translate the scriptures into that language. And after about a year of this, her informant one night is murdered. Totally unrelated to her work with this person. He's murdered. Now she has no informant. No one knows both languages. And then she gets notice from Jim Elliot that he wants to marry her. And so she feels the Lord leading her to marry him. She packs up all the note cards and all the data she's collected from that year. And she hikes to a place at the edge of the jungle where a bus will come and take her through the curvy roads and the high mountains to finally get to Quito, where she'll meet Jim Elliot and they'll get married. And somewhere on that trip, the suitcase disappeared. Her entire year's work gone. Nothing came out of it. She can't possibly duplicate it. There is no more informant. She's moving to another part of Ecuador, and it's like her whole year's work just evaporated in an instant. You're looking for some happy ending, and there isn't one. The book ends with this note of despair almost. Lord, why did you let that happen? And then she tells this parable. It's an apocryphal story, not in the Bible, it didn't really happen, but someone penned a story about Jesus walking along the roads of Judea with his disciples. And he stops at some moment and he says to each of them, I want you to choose a stone that you will carry for me. And so they look around the road and they each pick up a stone. And Simon Peter, he's thinking, well, a stone's a stone. I'm not going to pick up a big one, a heavy one that I have to struggle with. He picks up a tiny little pebble. I mean, this meets the letter of Jesus' command. And they walk on. And at lunchtime, Jesus stops and says, we'll have lunch now. And he turns all of their stones into bread. And he says, there's your lunch. Peter, of course, has just a morsel. He complains. But that's what he chose to carry for Jesus, and that's what he has. So after lunch, they walk on down the road, and Jesus stops once again. He looks at the disciples, and he says, choose a stone to carry for me. Well, this time, Peter says he's getting the biggest one that he could possibly manage, and he gets this huge rock, and it's all he can do to carry it. They walk on down the road for a few miles, and they come to a river, and Jesus says to them, now throw your stones in the river. They all throw their stones in the river, and Jesus walks on. Peter's like, wait just a minute. And he stops. Jesus, I don't understand. Earlier this morning we carried a stone and you turned it into bread. Now I carried a great big stone and you just had us throw it in the river. I don't understand. And Jesus looks at Peter and he just asks one question. For whom did you carry the stone? There's the question. For whom are you carrying your burdens? For whom are you giving your life? When you think God asks too much of you, too great a sacrifice, too costly a demand, look around you, look where you are, and you'll find that just like Abraham, the altar on which you give what God requires of you stands in the vicinity of a place called Golgotha, the very place where God provided himself a sacrifice. And anything God asks of you will always lie in the shadow of the cross. For whom are you carrying the stone? What in your life is too precious that you would hold it from God?